Welcome to Forbes Movies. Joining me now is Scott Mendelson, a Forbes entertainment analyst and box office pundit. Scott, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. Once again, this podcast is sponsored by Zevia. Please send me Zevia because they're expensive and I'm trying to cut back on Coke and Pepsi.
Well, on that note, what's new at the box office this weekend?
It's a very natural segue, but I have only myself to blame. This weekend, we have two major new releases. We've got Universal's Bros, which is quote unquote making history as the first major studio wide theatrical mainstream same-sex rom-com. And I have not seen it yet just because it got triaged. I like everybody in it, but honestly, the previews don't look all that funny to me. I'll see it probably tomorrow for pleasure. And if I have anything thoughtful to say, you'll read about it in the box office columns. That being said, it strikes me as the kind of picture that probably would have gotten made 20, 25 years ago, coming off the successes of films like In and Out and The Birdcage, had Hollywood not kind of been trapped in a tentpole and nothing else but tentpole whirlpool of their own making in the early 2000s, where they spent 10, 15 years prioritizing big budget, 4-quadrant PG-13 or PG family-friendly action fantasy films starring white people who discovered the special. Was this related to America's reaction to 9/11? Maybe. Was it merely correlation and not causation? Don't know. But I do think a lot of the quote unquote progressive gains that Hollywood was starting to making, relatively speaking, I'm thinking films like Rush Hour and Waiting to Exhale and Anaconda, and yes, The Birdcage and In and Out, would probably have led to an even greater embrace of the big or bigger budget mainstream Hollywood picture that wasn't just about, watch a white guy struggle, except things changed in the late 90s, early 2000s. Hollywood saw the appeal of the, big budget mega bucks movie that instead of spending $100 million for an action film and you'd hope to God you'd make 350 worldwide, you could spend 200 million and maybe make 650 to 800. And eventually, 10 years later, everybody was going after $1 billion. But that was partially after Avatar opened the floodgates for 3D and China became a factor. That was a way to sort of almost artificially juice the grosses of already successful movies, because studios only got back around 25% of the gross. Anyway, back to Bros. As a result, a movie like Bros or Love, Simon, or even Black Panther. Because in the late 90s, you had comic book superhero films or just superhero films like Mask of Zorro, Black Mask, Men in Black, Steel, Blade, that were just not white guy films almost as a matter of course. And depressingly enough, it wasn't really until X-Men and Spider-Man showed that the subgenre was safe for white guys that Hollywood kind of came in and took over the genre. And as a result, Blade Trinity was basically the last comic book superhero film of that scale until Black Panther, give or take periodic. Oh no, because Catwoman was before Blade Trinity. So yes, my point stands. I don't know, Bros is tracking for an over under $10 million opening weekend, which would have been terrible 20 years ago, but now it'll probably be a sigh of relief because the theatrical comedy has struggled so much, even before COVID in the last several years.
Why is that?
Oh, sorry. Um, Comedy has been always one of those subgenres that, to a certain extent, you can get it on TV without sacrificing much. And, the television sitcom has been as good at as, if not better than most theatrical comedies for the last 30 years. And that's not to say there haven't been a number of great, terrific comedies in theaters, whether they mainstream, like, Austin Powers or Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, or, indie stuff like, The Big Sick or Kissing Jessica Stein or what have you. But, on TV, you've had stuff like Friends, Seinfeld, 30 Rock, The Office, Fresh Off the Boat.
The list goes on and on, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I could spend 10 minutes, and that's not even counting the cable and streaming stuff. But really, in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen a change where, even as recently as 2016, a Kevin Hart movie, a Melissa McCarthy movie, a Will Ferrell movie, could open just on the strength of those names. Comedies tend to be cheaper than, big budget action movies, so you don't have to break records to break even. And with comic actors, because humor is so subjective, if you laughed at the last Melissa McCarthy movie, you're not going to care if critics don't like this one because they probably didn't like the last one either. That's not to say that, say, some Melissa McCarthy movies like Spy are better than some Melissa McCarthy movies like Identity Thief, but it's a different equation. Unfortunately, over the last 6 years, even that notion has kind of gone the way of the dinosaur. Will Ferrell movies have started going to Netflix. Adam Sandler kind of got ahead of the curve and jumped into the Netflix train before it was cool. And Kevin Hart, I mean, as of 2019, he could still open a movie. The Upside, which was basically a drama, opened to $20 million in early 2019. But since then, obviously the first 2 years were COVID related, but films like Me Time and Fatherhood and the Man from Toronto have gone to Netflix.
And on the total flip side of comedy, we have horror, and there is a horror movie coming out tomorrow. You saw it, I saw it. What did you think of Smile?
I was disappointed overall. I don't think it's a travesty. And the film is written and directed by Parker Finn. It's based on his short picture called Laura Hasn't Slept. It's very much in the vein of and I don't want to be too generic about this, with the J horror. By that I mean films that were either remakes of or riffs on Japanese horror films like The Ring and Dark Water and The Grudge. It also plays in a similar sandbox as something like Drag Me to Hell, where a young female protagonist is kind of sort of, I don't want to go into too many details because the trailers have been relatively cryptic. She basically gets cursed by something that if she doesn't figure out the puzzle soon, she's going to die. I don't think that's giving much away. That's pretty much how these movies work. However, the trick with these pictures is you need to provide present tense entertainment value while you're watching the heroine solve the mystery. Otherwise, you're just checking your watch waiting for the big reveal. And, that big reveal is usually in the last 5 minutes where, is she able to escape her fate or not? Yes, in some cases it's a he, but usually it's a she. Horror, by generically speaking, is often a very female-driven subgenre. This one is very well acted. What I liked about it is that there's a very overqualified supporting cast, including Jesse T. Usher. Kyle Gallner is very funny and feels very lived in as a sympathetic police officer. It's a very funny, nuanced performance from someone that's been in their share of horror films and knows the ropes. Cal Penn is very good as a sympathetic psychologist. The young woman played by Sosie Bacon, I apologize if I mispronounced that, is a psychiatrist, and he's her boss. Rob Morgan has a one scene cameo, the details of which I will not reveal, but it's a much better performance than that scene requires. And I think there's a lot of that in the movie where you have a perfectly fine leading lady. I mean, she's fine. She does what the material requires of her, which is mostly to be anxious and terrified and occasionally freak out because of a jump scare. But the supporting cast brings a lot to the table. I think it's also, no, go ahead.
I agree with you. I mean, I think like a good way to sum it up was, there's some good jump scares.
Yes.
But we saw this movie 20 years ago and a better version of it in The Ring, I think.
Yes.
I agree. And, to be fair, Gore Verbinski is a one-of-a-kind visual talent. And even back in 2002, getting $48 million for a horror film was kind of stunning. And, I was 22 at that time, but even then I was aware enough to know that, The Ring felt like the biggest, most sprawling and quote unquote epic mainstream horror film I had seen in a very long time. And in retrospect, looking at what came before and after, other than, maybe Hannibal, which had an $80 million budget, it felt like maybe like the biggest scoped, biggest scaled horror movie since, I don't know, Obie Hooper's Life Force or something like that, which is, that was a $40 million sci-fi, horror film back in 1985 or whatever. And it looks it. I'm not saying it's a great movie, but the money's on the screen. Um, Back to Smile, my biggest issue with it is that too many of the scariest scenes in the films are either dreams or fake outs. And by fake outs, I mean it's either, oh, it's just a cat, that kind of gimmick, or they're scenes that turn out not to be what you think they are. And it gets to the point where you cannot believe your own eyes, even in scenes that are supposed to be emotionally involving.
Yeah, and I think they overplayed that hand a little bit. I mean, the first time or two, it did what it was intended to do, but after that, it kind of wore off its luster a bit.
It's also a very, it's for a horror film, it's pretty long. It's 115 minutes, which would be okay, except the film sort of starts from the ground. I mean, it just takes off like a bullet to its credit. The first 13 minutes, bam, the story is set up. But
Yeah.
after that, there's, and the character, I would argue, hits emotional and psychological rock bottom by the end of the first act. There is a where she basically finds herself absolutely on the outs for good reason, all due respect, with her, her friends, her family, and her coworkers, and you've got nowhere left to go at this point. And but the film goes on for another good hour and change after that sequence. Um, the film is getting decent reviews. There are plenty of critics that like it more than I did. No judgment. You might like it more than me. My wife, who agreed with my criticism, still enjoyed the movie for what it was more than I did. She did get more out of the jump scares than I did, and whatever, that's fine. That's good because I convinced her to see it with me.
Yeah,
So I
that
would
is
have felt
good.
like I felt better when she told me she liked it more.
Good.
Um, but so yeah, I mean, if you want an original horror film and you've already seen Barbarian, it's harmless. I don't think it's very good, but it's not gonna make you mad that you showed up.
That's a good analysis.
So
Critics say it's harmless and you won't be mad if you show up.
I, I mean, it's not the exact review you want to hear, but like if you're in the movie or directed it or anything. But I mean, I think that's an accurate representation. But I do now want to switch gears to a series that recently dropped on Netflix, and it's Ryan Murphy's Dahmer. How has that performed on Netflix so far?
The I think it's like a 10-part hour and change each miniseries, so it's incredibly long, which if it had been a 2 3 hour miniseries, I probably would have watched it by now. I believe it pulled like 196 million hours viewed in its global debut. Now that was in the first 5 days because they debuted on a Wednesday and not a Friday. Off the top of my head, that's one of their biggest single week / single weekend totals for any Netflix show in that space of time, behind only behind I think the season 4 drop of Stranger Things and the second season 4 drop of Stranger Things, because as you know they had the first 7 episodes and then a month later they dropped the last 2 episodes, and I think the opening weekend and then the next full week of Bridgerton season 2. So it's in rare territory. What's interesting about it is it's the first Ryan Murphy project through a lucrative Netflix deal that I would argue is an unmitigated smash hit. Most of the big bucks development deals in the streaming era have not paid off. Shonda Rhimes is the exception to the rule. She has given them 2 seasons of Bridgerton and 1 season of Inventing Anna. Is it Anna or Ava? I apologize.
It's Inventing Anna, I think, but
Oh, okay. Yes.
yeah.
And A, those are both incredibly popular shows, and B, the latter is basically the only one of those ripped from the headlines, recent true life scandal, whatever's that people actually watched. Other than I think the Dropout was popular on a Hulu curve, and I
And
would say the Dropout was the best of those by default.
So, how does this stack up to these other real life miniseries? Is this one of the stronger performing ones?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I because obviously I don't want to compare and contrast something on Netflix versus something on Hulu, because the subscriber base is very different, and something that is a success on Hulu, like something like Prey, which was very good by the way, might not have been a success if it pulled those same numbers on Netflix. And that's sort of the issue. It drives me nuts as a stats nerd, as a box office junkie, is we're trying to make conclusions and do analysis of these numbers, but A, we don't always have the raw numbers in front of us. B, we can't always trust the raw numbers in front of us because there's not that as much trustworthy third party verification, I would argue. And B, you're dealing with different streaming platforms that have different subscriber bases, both in terms of volume and in terms of demographics. That being said, I mean, a ton of people watch Dahmer. I mean, objectively speaking, it's a huge hit. It's an important hit because, again, it's Ryan Murphy. The Politician got canceled after 2 seasons, and from what I gathered, nobody watched the second season. Ratched got lousy reviews and was momentarily popular for the first 2 weeks or so, which is frankly normal for any number of Netflix shows and movies where you're hot for 10 days and then you get replaced by the next big thing. There are exceptions, and that's when you have an exception, that's when you know something is a Netflix hit, if it sticks around past 10 days.
And I do want to talk about, I know this was widely popular, as you were saying, and you and I have talked extensively about, Twitter controversies aren't real life. They live on Twitter. But this one felt different. And this one was did you see the viral video of one of the sister of one of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims' impact statement on on the Netflix show?
I am aware of it. I did not watch it.
Okay, so she responded reportedly on Insider that she was not contacted by Netflix about this. She didn't receive any compensation. Her family did not receive any compensation. And she said, quote, to Insider, "It's sad that they're just making money off of this tragedy. That's just greed." Do you think these types of shows are exploiting victims and their families and just re-traumatizing them again?
Yes and no. And, for the record, sympathy notwithstanding, it is not the job of a production company or filmmakers to contact every single person associated with a true life story and get their blessing and or permission and or to cut them a check. That just, if they had cut her a check, there'd be a dozen other people that would come out the woodwork and say, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you consult me? Where's my money? And that would be fair. I mean, that's one reason. That's one reason journalists generally don't pay for sources, aside from ethics considerations. And as far as yes, this is the kind of controversy that only exists on the internet. Are they exploiting? Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's it's entertainment is by definition, not essential. Again, you could argue it's another example of how Netflix trying to sell itself for the last couple of years as a progressive and better than the rest company is just that. It's promotional. Netflix is not your friend. They may not be your enemy. They're not under obligation to be your friend. But the idea that they are virtuous and good and different and better than everybody else because some of their content is more progressive than conventional studio output. I mean, I think this year was kind of a mask off moment in that respect, with the caveat that, again, these are big corporations run by adults making adult decisions for adult reasons. My issue is not that Netflix has tried to position itself as holier than thou. It's frankly, my issue is that so many people in the media and the pundit class have fallen for it. I remember a few years ago, Steven Spielberg got in hot water for comments that he didn't even actually say. It was a bad game of telephone where he claimed that he had said that Netflix movies shouldn't compete at the Oscars because they're not real theatrical films. What he actually said is that that theaters should be showing them. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't want to misquote him after the fact, but the blowback from that was like, oh, Steven Spielberg is elitist and he's racist and he's sexist because he doesn't want Netflix films to compete. The implication being that, yes, many Netflix films and television shows are more diverse and progressive than the conventional theoretical stereotypical studio output. And that's not incorrect. In fact, I would argue most of their best stuff happens to be stuff that's more inclusive and diversive. And maybe that's because those participants have more skin in the game. I don't know, but I think, my favorite Netflix movie is Spike Lee's Da 5 Bloods. I think their best studio programmer is The Harder They Fall. I think generally where they falter is when they try to make a stereotypical Hollywood mockbuster, blockbuster that plays like conventional white guy cinema, something like, Red Notice, and it just comes off as an insanely over budget, inferior variation of the genuine article. But getting back to Dahmer, I apologize. I went way off the reservation as I often do.
No, Scott, we always love when you do that. But I do We can move on. And speaking of
sympathetic to her concerns. I will say that, and I have to tread very carefully here because I have not seen the show. From what I've read, the films, the miniseries, whatever you want to call it, is more upfront about the notion that many of his victims were non-white, and that he was able to get away with it for so long because of institutional racism and the notion that these victims would be more invisible than, say, a hot white college girl. And that is something, if that's true, then I think the miniseries does deserve credit for that, because that's something that we've all talked about. I mean, fun trivia. Jeffrey Dahmer grew up in my hometown. He killed his first victim in Akron, Ohio, which is where I lived. He went to my high school. Now, he did do most of his murders in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I think one of the reasons why the show is as popular as it is, at least momentarily, is that
you didn't know him, right? Did you know him? No, you're not. You're nowhere the same age.
no.
Yeah.
I was a kid. I came back from summer camp in the summer of 91. I was 11, and the whole town was buzzing about what had happened in the last 2 weeks since I was gone.
Wow.
That's an interesting 2 weeks to miss.
And that being said, I do think there's some kind of skewed generational nostalgia about this specific case, because people under my age, they vividly remember when he was arrested and they discovered his house of horrors and what have you. That being said, I think, like a lot of these true crime documentaries, miniseries, special events, if you just want education, Google a podcast called You're Wrong About, and look for the 60 to 90-minute episode on the Jeffrey Dahmer show. There's a great one on the Clinton impeachment. There's like a 5-part thing on the DC sniper that I think should have won a Pulitzer. It's incredibly detailed and insightful. And the podcast basically goes into older news stories from a bygone age and sort of digs into what wasn't covered at the time, what social trends possibly motivated why they were discussed the way they were discussed. And usually the big reveal is, hey, look, it's because of sexism and racism. And it's almost a running joke that, yeah, no kidding. But again, that's a terrific podcast. I got addicted to it during the early months of lockdown. But again, I have mixed feelings about this particular controversy. I'm certainly sympathetic because, again, Netflix is going to make a lot of money on the people, implicitly on the victims of the people Jeffrey Dahmer murdered.
Yeah, and they have to watch it play out again.
But that's the way the world works. And if you want to take a stand, just don't watch.
Yeah, we'll leave that conversation there. And I do want to talk about 2 separate announcements that came out recently. One is that the Blade director parted ways with the film, and it's 2 months before production is set to begin. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, this has happened to Marvel before. They had Patty Jenkins on board for Thor: The Dark World. They parted ways over creative differences. Alan Taylor came on and made a perfectly well received at the time. Now everybody pretends it's the worst Marvel movie, whatever. It made a 205 million domestic, 644 worldwide on a 180-ish budget. Everybody was fine. Edgar Wright was developing Ant-Man for many years. And then eventually and again, this is 7-8-year-old gossip here. Basically his vision did not align with the post-Avengers plan for a more explicitly interconnected Marvel universe. I don't know if that's actually the case, but whatever. They parted ways. Peyton Reed came on, who had previously done Bring It On, Down with Love, and films of that nature. Made a perfectly good and crowd-pleasing Ant-Man that made 181 domestic, 520 worldwide on a 130 budget. I think Ant-Man and the Wasp is one of Marvel's best sequels. And Edgar Wright went on to make Baby Driver, which was his first and so far only worldwide commercial hit. So in some cases, not working with Marvel, both sides can have a happy ending. I mean, that's what happened with Doctor Strange, where Scott Derrickson parted ways with Marvel for the sequel. And Sam Raimi came on and made a very Sam Raimi-ish Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, while Scott Derrickson went back to Universal / Blumhouse, made an not original, it's based on a Joe Hill novel, The Black Phone, which I think is Scott Derrickson's best film. And it was a huge sleeper hit this summer. with rave reviews. And, in a skewed way, him scoring good reviews and solid box office on a movie like The Black Phone, where it's more likely to be associated with him, maybe does more good for his career than just being a metaphorical gun for hire on a big Marvel movie. So, I don't think this is the end of the world for either party, and they will find a new director. Maybe it'll be somebody in their TV crew. Maybe it'll be somebody. I mean, my personal fan cast choice is J.D. Dillard, just because I liked Slight. I liked Sweetheart. It's a monster movie he made a few years back with, I believe, Cassie Levens. No, not Casey Levens. She's the director. Let's see, who was that? She was. There's about 5 different people I'm mistaking it for. No, it is Kiersey Levens. I just mispronounced her name wrong. Kiersey Clemens. I'm sorry, that's why I got it screwed up. And that's a terrific, woman versus monster movie. Slight was a very low budget but very interesting, kind of superhero, kind of sci-fi, but not really. And he has a movie called Devotion coming out in Thanksgiving. It's a Korean War drama with Jonathan Majors and Glenn Powell from Top Gun Maverick. And I'm always thrilled when an up-and-coming director gets a chance, not at a big franchise, but at a mid-budget, decently budgeted studio programmer. A movie. And when go ahead.
Before I let you go, I do want to ask you about another announcement this week, and that was from Deadpool 3. Ryan Reynolds announced that Hugh Jackman is coming back as Wolverine. What do you think about that?
Oh, I mean, on one hand, it's a little depressing.
Why?
Because it's sort of, this is what people apparently want now, where the films almost don't matter. All that matters is who shows up and rubs elbows with each other.
And has that been the response?
It's been mixed.
Okay.
And again, this is, when you deal with perpetually online conversations, that's what you're going to get a lot of, the end of cinema, to a certain extent, Hugh Jackman, I don't think he needs the money. I don't think he needs the work or anything silly like that. But I do think, it's not even how it was in 2014, 2015, or even, 2013 when, Hugh Jackman could open a movie like Prisoners to $20 million. The Front Runner, nobody showed up. Bad Education, which is one of his very best performances, by the way, went straight to HBO, partially because of COVID, but nonetheless. And yeah, even as late as 2017, The Greatest Showman was an incredible smash hit. But then, frankly, once Disney bought Fox, the property kind of sort of, again, whether causation or correlation, I don't know, or coincidence or causation, I don't know, the property kind of got buried on Disney Plus.
And do you think he's going to add value to the movie for people that you are? Okay, well, we will leave it at that. Scott Mendelson, thank you so much.
Yeah, and if I may, it's not the end of the world. He'll come, he'll have a good time, he'll still make other movies, and if people don't show up to those movies, then it's their fault.
Well, we will see. We still have like 2 years because it comes out September 2024. So hopefully we'll have that conversation then.
And in theaters this November and help him win an Oscar.
Thanks, Scott.